So when you come out of fight or flight and you go into a much healthier rest and digest mode for more of the time, which is where we're designed to live, when you're more comfortable with who you are, with your quirks, with your strengths, with your tricksiness, then you are not hypervigilant and you perceive less things as threats, including other women.
This is the Unquiet Sisterhood podcast, where we have uncensored, unapologetic, and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about shit that matters in the lives of women. I'm your host, Jen Pavich. Hey there, welcome to episode 16. So before we dive into this week's episode, I wanted to just mention briefly that I have a few individual coaching spots opening up in October and November. So as some of you may know, I only work with a small handful of individual clients at a time because we really do deep work and I customize the learning to each woman that I work with. So I have a few different one-on-one programs, but essentially I work with women who are ready to take their game to the next level. And this work might be for you if you've been reading self-help books or maybe listening to podcasts and trying to do some self-development work for a while, but you're not really sure either how to implement the things that you learn, or maybe you're not sure how to apply the skills, which is totally understandable. It can be difficult to do that on your own. So a lot of the women that I talk with will tell me that really what they want is just to feel better, to stop being so hard on themselves and figure out how to move forward and know that they're moving toward what they want, or at least toward figuring out what they want, rather than just kind of getting through the day. Other clients have come to me when they do know exactly what they want, and it's often something really big, but they're a little afraid to go after it, or they're not sure where to start. So if you'd like to learn more about working with me, you can head on over to jenpavich.com and check it out. And just so you know, before I work with any clients, I always just schedule a free discovery call so that we can learn a little bit more about each other and kind of decide if it's going to be a good fit. So if you want to hop on a call like that and chat, you can schedule that on the website as well. Okay, on to the episode. This week, I am talking with the absolutely lovely Sarah Bishop. Sarah is a coach in the UK with a background in educational leadership. She works with highly sensitive, neurodiverse women to help them get back in touch with their own brilliance, wisdom, and inner magic so that they can enjoy successful careers without the overwhelm. Sarah brings all sorts of wonderful magic and skills into her work, including leadership and change management work, hypnotherapy, NLP, reiki, coaching, and more. So this is a great conversation and I can't wait to get started. All right, let's go. Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jen. I am super excited to be here. I love your podcast, so I'm so thrilled that you asked me to do this.
Oh, thank you. And I'm super excited to talk about all the awesome stuff you're doing. And to start out, what I would love to do is just read a little bit of text that I found at the top of your website that just really, really hit home for me. And what it says is, if you are hiding who you are, paddling like Billy O under the water, burning the midnight oil, wearing industrial strength armor, yet still feeling overwhelmed and juggling imposter syndrome, that's not success. That's being duped by the system. Just wow. When I read that, it was like a million little fireworks went off.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That was very much written from the heart and from personal experience and something that I really felt deeply, and it came from that place. So I'm so glad that it kind of resonates.
For sure. And I think I'm sure it resonates with a lot of women, because I think, a lot of us do have that sense of having to work kind of twice as hard, and also this sort of cultural pressure to make all of our work look effortless all the time. I know Brene Brown talks about this from her research, this idea of, women are supposed to be everything to everyone, but we're supposed to make it look effortless. How have you seen that in your work?
I see it all the time. I see it with the women that I've worked with previously, and the place that it came from, Jen, was that was what I was doing. That was what I was doing. That's why it was such a sort of heartfelt piece that I wrote, because that was very much what I was doing, and I felt very much throughout. So I've been 10 years as a senior leader in education. And had quite a messy journey as part of that. I think it's to be fair. And yet I say I've had a messy journey, yet most people who will have been alongside me on that journey would not have known. So that notion, there's a couple of things around that for me. One is I do think, and I would say, I think females tend to have worked harder to get into positions of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we feel the need, and I think it's a real need, to kind of, we almost have to prove more to be given credibility and to be seen as competent. I think that is less freely given. So I think we work harder. But that thing about paddling like Billy O, burning the midnight oil, I think definitely what you said about, we need to make it look effortless. That swan, that was the real swan metaphor for me, the swan on the surface, but paddling like Billy O underneath. And that is exhausting, and it has a cost that we don't talk about. So then when we are struggling, we're hiding that. So I think for lots of us, it spills out at home, in our private life, in our health. And yet we still go back, and in that very public sphere, we put on that swan-like appearance and we're paddling like Billy O. And I just really, that was very personal to me, because it was what I've done. Historically, that's a pattern that I've run. I don't do it anymore, but that's taken a long journey. And that's partly why I then wanted to call it out and say I'm in a different place. And I know there are people still doing that. And it has such a high cost, personally, that I really feel that there's a conversation about how we define success at work for us in a way that makes sense for us, especially if you are a highly sensitive or tick differently female. So how do we define success in a way that makes sense to us? And how do we define those qualities of leadership? Because part of the reason we are paddling like Billy O is because we're playing a game where the rules are set against us from the start. We're playing a game that we're not designed to win. And then we're wondering why we're struggling. And then when we are struggling, we're looking at ourselves and saying, well, it's because I'm not enough, or I'm wrong, or I'm not out for leadership. Well, by those standards, possibly so. Maybe we need a diversity of what we consider qualities of leadership. And that's kind of what I'm interested in, and where some of my stuff comes from.
Yes, I love that. And also, like when I'm hearing you say that the people around you would not have said that it was a messy journey to get where you are, that brings up two things for me. And the first is like how much we feel pressured to hide our experience, our vulnerability, anything that feels less than perfect from the people around us.
Yeah.
And also I think there's a piece that often what we're doing is not as messy as we think it is.
Yes.
Like if we're defining anything less than utter perfection as a mess, then yes, it probably feels really messy.
Yeah, absolutely.
From a realistic perspective, I think that that's just life and what real life and real work looks like.
Yeah.
The other thing that occurred to me when you said this, and this is actually something that I have been really into looking at lately, and I'm going to be doing a community project later this year that's actually focused on this, is this idea of if women feel pressured to put up this kind of facade, the swan on the surface, if you will, like, this kind of perfect shell that we portray to the outside world, then what that means is if we're all doing that, and then we look around at each other and we see all of these, albeit fake images of perfection, it just reinforces the same thing over and over and over.
Absolutely. What we're doing, I totally agree, Jen, is unwittingly and unknowingly, we are reinforcing the thing that's got us into a mess. And that's so unhelpful for everyone around us. And I think for everyone that works with us, you know, we're not showing up fully, we're not showing our best. You know, if we're hiding who we are, then we're hiding our tricksiness, but we're also hiding our gifts. So we're not showing up fully. That, you know, that means that we're not giving the best of ourselves. But also, importantly, I think you're right. I think, you know, I think there needs to be a diversity of qualities of leadership. You know, there's more than one way to be a strong, and I use air quotes with that, a strong leader. But if we're all trying to fit ourselves into this box that we don't really fit into, it says this is the way that you do leadership, then things are never going to change. And I have a notion about this, the people that we work with, but I have a real sense of mission, purpose and legacy. And I feel there are females that are behind us, that are younger than us, that we are kind of leading the way for. And I kind of think, how do we light the way for them to do things in a better way and a more healthy way? And if we just keep doing the same old, then we're just going to keep sort of perpetuating the same myth.
Right. As long as we keep trying to fit ourselves into the tiny box that is defined by patriarchal leadership, like, it's not really doing much. Yeah. For like the women that come behind us. I love that. So you mentioned earlier that you work with highly sensitive women, and also kind of on your website, I think the term you use is like neurodiverse or a tick differently female. So tell me more about, what does that mean? And also, do most women know if, you know, this kind of applies to them?
That's so interesting. And I just love this conversation, because the answer is yes and no. I think to do women know. Language is a funny thing. We use lots of terms, don't we? And they mean different things to different people. And I think unpacking some of that is really helpful. So I know I talk about neurodiversity, and the phrase I like for me, sort of coming from the north of England, is tick a bit differently. And that kind of means, I guess, that I'm wired slightly differently. I operate slightly differently in the world. I guess a metaphor would be being a MacBook in a world of Windows sometimes. Does that make sense?
Yes,
it's kind of that notion. And I think if this applies to you, either the highly sensitive thing or the neurodiverse, or tick a bit differently, as a female, I think you will know, but you may not have the language for it or a framework for it. Mm-hmm. So I guess by that I mean that this is something that you grow up being. I guess it's not a choice, and it's not necessarily something that comes later. So I think throughout your life you have a sense of knowing that you do things a bit differently.
And I suspect for some women this would probably be like there was some kind of label slapped on it at some point or another.
Yeah, very, very possibly. And I think the thing for females is there's a number of things that have happened. We tend to be very good at camouflaging and masking from an early age. So if we know we are ticking differently and we look around us, if we have the intellectual capacity, and this is where it's interesting, because I think a lot of us that fit into this, that are struggling at work, are intellectually able. Mm-hmm. But so there's a couple of areas that it tends to leak out in. There's cognitive stuff. So you tend to have a very spiky profile. So you tend to have real peaks and troughs of things that you are gifted at and things that you find incredibly difficult. And sometimes the interesting thing is that the things you find incredibly difficult are the more everyday things. So if you grew up kind of with that question of how can I kind of academically get these grades and be perceived as clever, air quotes again, because there's another word, yet I can't do everyday stuff, then it's likely that you've got some neurodiversity going on. So for example, I've got really good long-term memory. I can remember detailed stuff, I can learn stuff. My academic profile is strong. I've got good grades throughout my life. I don't have a good working memory. So if you gave me some instructions and I left the room, I'll have forgotten what you've asked me to do by the time I've got to the stairs. Mm-hmm. I have some difficulties with auditory processing sometimes. So actually understanding what someone has just said to me, kind of, so there's some real weird peaks and troughs, if you like, and you'll have had those all your life. But I think, especially if you are an intellectually able female, you have got super gifted at mitigating that, at getting round that. And this is the bit that I think then tips into being unhealthy as you get older, is you get really good at blending in and masking. And so you hide those difficulties.
And I'm guessing that takes up a ton of energy.
A ton of energy. And I think because you get so good at doing it, it's almost kind of becomes, you forget that you learn to do it, and it becomes kind of almost an automatic pattern. Mm-hmm. And again, I guess metaphors are helpful, but if you've got a desktop and a program running and then you minimize it, you can't see it on your desktop, but it's still running and it's taking your battery. And that's kind of how I see some of this stuff. It's like it's out of your conscious awareness now because you've done it for so long, but it is draining your battery. Other indicators can be social stuff. So there's a bit of a myth that, you know, some tick a bit differently folk can't do socializing. We can, but it can be exhausting. So group stuff, social chit chat, small talk can be difficult. One-to-one stuff and friendships can be much easier. But if we do a lot of social stuff, we tend to need time to recuperate. So it's kind of knowing that and acknowledging that, if that makes sense.
Some of that too sounds like, so for those of our listeners that have not heard of the term highly sensitive used in this way, or HSP, I will drop a website in the show notes where you can learn more about that. But particularly for introverted HSPs, highly sensitive people, I've heard that that's very true. And, you know, HSPs make up, is it 8% of the population? Like it's a decent amount. Yeah. And the vast majority of those are introverts. I happen to be an extroverted HSP, so, which is a whole different complex, because I kind of have the two sides of me pulling at each other, you know, wanting opposite things, and I have to figure out how to balance that.
Yeah. And it's that balancing act. I think, as you say, and all of this for me, Jen, is about just getting insight into yourself and knowing a little bit more, because that stuff about running out of conscious awareness, when you bring it into awareness, when you start shining a light on it and just being curious, not judging, so there's no judgment with this stuff. That's really important. It's just about being curious about how we tick and how we run. The more I know about how I tick and how I run, the more options I have. And the more flexibility I can kind of get, and the more I can start being curious about what works for me. And certainly, as you say, that there's an interesting mix for me between the HSP stuff and the neurodiversity. So within that, it's quite an umbrella term, but if you look at things like, for example, autism, which again is another word and a label, and I have some ambivalence around them because I think sometimes they can be limiting. So I think it's how you use it, and I think individuals do that in the best way for them. But one of the things that we do know is that the traditional triad of impairments that was used for kind of almost identifying autism was about social communication, social interaction, imagination and flexibility. All of that was designed for males. Mm-hmm. So if you were a male youngster struggled with that.
Asperger's.
Yes.
Like it's very, 10 years ago, the statistics that I was looking at were like, it's far more prevalent in males than females.
Yeah.
But I actually suspect that that's not even true. It's just that females are culturally conditioned to hide it better.
Yeah. There's a number of things that we're conditioned to hide it better. So we camouflage and mask, which means that it doesn't get seen the same, because we become really, really good at that. But also it presents differently in women. So you've got something that presents very different, it shows up differently in females, and yet the criteria, if you like, the checklist, the diagnostics for knowing whether you had that were very much geared to the male presentation. So if you have a female presentation of something and you're being sort of assessed against a male presentation, they're not going to fit. And so I think the latest sort of research acknowledges that, you know, there's definitely been a shift on this for our younger our younger generation. You know, they will have a different experience.
And I want to interject here because I feel like this is a whole podcast waiting to happen. That phenomenon that you just described is true of almost every aspect of health.
Yes.
Almost every aspect of physical and mental health that we're looking at, the baseline or kind of the bar was set by, you know, research on males, which leaves this other 51% of the population kind of at loose ends when it comes to diagnoses and you know, looking at research and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so all of that is in the mix. And that's where I find it really fascinating that, you know, as females, we can take all of that, we can cope with that, we can find ways of managing that are, you know, beautifully crafted so that we blend in, and then we take all of that to work. And I guess the interesting thing for me is, with everything, is if what you're doing is working really well for you, then crack on, that's grand, carry on, you know, why wouldn't you? You know, that's fab. And I think for lots of us, that masking has, for a short time, or for a certain period of time, it was set up and designed by us to help us survive, and it's done that. And in short terms, we kind of get success. This is why I play around with that notion of how do we define success, because from an external worldview, lots of us who do this really well, we get success. You know, we have achievements in the outside world, we're paddling like Billy-O to keep them and get them, but we have what externally you would see as success. And I think it's at the point, and certainly with me, which was the stage that I got to, was I got to the point where I realized it was no longer sustainable. You know, masking, hiding who I was, paddling like Billy-O, all of that stuff, working that hard to maintain this myth around myself wasn't sustainable. And I got called upon that because my health suffered. You know, I reached a point with my health where, and this will be familiar, I'm sure, to lots of people, where my body kind of stepped in and said, enough, this is no longer happening.
And I think that that's the case for a lot of women, because it's not, you know, like you said, when you're doing this, it's just kind of like the program running in the background. And, you know, and I say this as someone who did the same thing for a very long time. And you kind of don't realize that that's what you're doing. Yeah. But for most people, I feel like it's usually something big, often in the health realm, that steps in, is like, no, this is not working.
Absolutely. And and that is exactly, you know, my story with this. And I got to that point where I was like, this is no longer sustainable. And I'm no longer prepared to sacrifice my health and who I really am. It was kind of like this, you know, who I really was no longer prepared to be so squashed down for a measure of success that actually, I've not actually sat and really thought about whether I want that. You know, it's just kind of expectations, norms, doing the things that we do. And so I hit that point where I was kind of like, okay, I know what I'm doing now is not sustainable and I don't want to be doing this. So if I don't want this, what do I want instead? And that's the bit that I love helping other people with, because it's when you get to that point where you're kind of like, okay, but I've done this for so long. Holy moly, what's the alternative? I've never done it differently. Like, how do you do it differently? You know, that's the bit that I love doing. And that's the point that I got to. I was kind of like, how do I do this differently?
And did you know, when you started having health issues, where it was coming from?
Not originally. And again, I'm sure this will probably be, you know, I'm sure I'm not alone with this. So at the very start of my career, because I think for those of us that do tick differently, the world of work is quite hard to navigate. You know, there's a whole new set of norms and rules that you don't quite get, that everyone else seems to naturally understand. You're like, what the heck? And at the start of my career, I came down with what they call chronic fatigue, which I now understand was just overwhelm on trying to process, fit in and blend, and be in an unfamiliar territory, if you like, that I'd not got to grips with. And so I kind of did what a lot of us do, which is to have a bit of a be strong driver and push through, and got back on and kind of worked things out. And then I hit, about 8 years ago, I hit burnout and depression in a big way. And that was the real mark for me. And that's the point when I knew where that was coming from, that I kind of said that, you know, I need to do things very differently. And it was at that point that I kind of knew that I didn't have the resources that I needed kind of within me. I needed to skill up. I needed to get different resources. I needed to find different patterns and ways of being. And I kind of meandered off the traditional leadership path, and I went on a different journey, and I became a master practitioner in NLP. I do Reiki. I'm a qualified hypnotherapist. And it's kind of those modalities that I brought back to my leadership within a career setting, and a more formal setting. And those are the things that I absolutely have said, they root me down and enable me to do things differently now.
Yeah. And speaking of leadership, so I know that you have some new work coming out soon that talks about kind of leadership. And let's just start with like the term leadership. What does that mean to you?
Well, that's what's changed. And this is what I'm excited about with people, is that previously I used to think leadership was something that was a post or a role that you aspired to, that you got career progression, and all of a sudden you're a leader. And it struck me when I was reflecting, at what point do you become a leader? And it's kind of, was it when I was pastoral lead, or was it when I was assistant head or deputy head, which is the equivalent of a vice principal in the US? It's kind of like, at which stage do I accept that I'm a leader? And the notion that I have, and I'm really interested in exploring, particularly in the times that we are in, because we are in such turbulent times, you know, globally, politically, on every level. And I really have this notion about, actually, leadership is something for everyone. Whoever you are, whatever you do, there is something about courageous leadership within your own life, mastery of your own fate. What do you stand for? You know, what will you let pass, and what will you call out? What will you collude with, and what will you not? And there's a real notion for me around, all of us have an amazing capacity to be leaderful and to take concrete action within our own circles of control and our circles of influence. And I think there's exciting stuff that can happen when we're all prepared to do that.
I absolutely agree. And I think that, you know, what you described at first, where leadership is coming from, like kind of like the role or sort of the title or whatever the case may be, I think women have been in that space of waiting for those titles and roles to be conferred primarily by men for a long ass time. And we can't wait anymore.
No, absolutely.
You have to show up and take it.
Yeah, it is. It's showing up fully. You know, I talk about showing up fully at work, and it is that thing as well. Show up fully in your own life. First and foremost, you know, show up fully in your own life, and understand that it's not something that somebody confers upon you. You know, it's not within anybody else's gift actually to give you. Leadership is something that you decide for yourself, that you're going to stand up and lead within your own life. And I think that's super important. And I think for those of us that are in what you would traditionally call positions of leadership within careers and within roles, I think now more than ever, you know, if you have a chance to influence in any way anybody, then I think we need to be doing that in service of good. Now more than ever. And and I think females and the role that females have to play in that collectively within communities is huge.
I think so too. And I think that the word influence is almost the key there, because I think it's a question of thinking about leadership in terms of what you might be able to influence and how you might be able to, you know, kind of bring your ideas and your authenticity out in a way that changes hearts and minds, or starts something amazing in your community, rather than looking at leadership from a perspective of it only comes when power has been conferred upon you.
Absolutely. And it's really changing that conversation, isn't it? Because power for me sort of is almost a very male driven, orientated view of what leadership is about. And actually leadership for me isn't about power. Leadership for me is about service. You know, it's about being in service, and leadership isn't is no place for ego. And when you start to understand that, I think you are more able to show up as a leader with imperfection. So being perfectly imperfect is one of my learning points that I learned to be. And actually, if you're comfortable with being perfectly imperfect, then you give yourself permission to show up more honestly, more fully as yourself. And again, you know, that stuff you spoke about, Jen, about influence, when you do that, I think you give other people around you, other females, and anybody, you know, you give them permission to do the same.
Yeah, because I do feel like, you know, we have this view in our culture of leadership that is this top-down mentality, but leadership can be organic. Leadership can be collaborative, and it's often much more powerful when you come at it from that angle than sort of, you know, imposing structure from the top down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we're seeing that more than ever, you know, globally, and with lots of different areas. You know, you look at things like climate change, the traditional models of top-down leadership and power. You know, I've talked about leadership is, for me, being in service. Well, the people that are holding the power are not always acting, for me, in ways of service to those kind of things. And therefore, it's kind of like, well, if that's not happening, then we all can step up as leaders, you know, and we can all influence and we can all do those things. And as you say, it becomes organic change then.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the effect that that can have is twofold, right? Like, you can either to sort of look at the, you know, the people that are quote unquote in power are not doing the right thing. And that can really bring, I think, for some people, like this sense of like helplessness or hopelessness. But the fact is that creates an opportunity for us to create a different model, to start working more from the ground up.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I talk a lot within the work that I do about circles of control and circles of influence. And I think you look at what is within those realms and you work there. And I think if you do that, you feel less helpless. There is some stuff that's out of our control as individuals, and I think you know there's a level of acceptance with that, because that's not where you want to put your energy, because that will just leak. But certainly looking at what is within your control and what is within your influence is huge. And again, I think, you know, circling back to that notion of how do you start dropping the mask, if that's something that you've done as a female for a long time. Starting with that is actually a really good way of doing it. So that's showing up perfectly imperfect and learning to be comfortable with that, but also realizing what is within your control, what is within your influence, and starting there is really helpful as well.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, it also gives us, just because the, you know, powers that be might be doing stuff that is frankly batshit crazy a lot of the time. Doesn't mean that we're off the hook. You know, like it's really easy to kind of like succumb to that, like you withdraw into hopelessness and kind of, it feels like, you know, like I think for a lot of people, they feel like, oh, there's nothing I can do, so I'm just going to kind of stay in my own world, ignore everything that's going on, you know, around that kind of thing. But there are opportunities to kind of step in, and we are being called so deeply to step in, especially I feel like I think the world is telling us right now.
I think lots of us feel that, you know, fire in the belly, that calling, that sense of a calling. Absolutely. And I totally get as well that because I do highly sensitive and I do tick differently, I find the news quite overwhelming at times. I have to ration. I do have to ration how
everybody should be rationed, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it affects us.
Yeah, it does. And then it kind of, you know, you've got to balance your well-being. And so I find that really difficult. Having said, so my natural instinct would be to withdraw. That would be my natural instinct. From the stuff that's going on, it would be to withdraw, to go completely into my fictional worlds that I love, that are my respite.
Yep.
You know, to dive into Hogwarts and not resurface.
Yep.
So I totally get that. And I guess there's that fire in the belly though, and that calling that says, actually, we need to dig deep. We need to dig deep and not look away. And I might need to ration and be careful about how I intake some of that stuff. And I need to keep coming back to that circles of control and influence so I avoid that helplessness. But I also there is a real calling in me that says, you know what we were talking about at the beginning, I will not collude. You know, I will not stay silent. I will not collude. I will not withdraw. I will put a line in the sand that says, this is enough. And I talk, some of the stuff that I'm looking at, that I'm working on, is this notion of courageous leadership and gentle rebellion. And rebellion for me is about when you know that stuff is going on that's not right, and you're prepared to stand up and say, enough, I will not be part of this, I will not let this pass. And, you know, I'm such a fictional fan and that's how I tick. But for me, you know, if I think of rebellion, I'm thinking of the Order of the Phoenix in Harry Potter. Yeah. I'm thinking of the Fellowship of the Ring. I'm thinking of the Jedi Rebellion, you know, the Alliance. You know, that thing that says, I will stand up and I'll be counted. And I think for those of us that feel that calling, we have a need to kind of express that and find ways of having action that can influence.
Absolutely. And I think that the rationing that you bring up is an excellent point, because I think when, you know, it can be really tempting when you are someone that is, you know, really invested in what's going on in the world and is used to sort of keeping up with current events and that kind of thing. But the fact is, in the last few years, what used to come at us over 6 months of a news cycle is hitting us in a week.
Yes.
And it's not to say don't, you know, keep up on things. I'm certainly not advocating burying your head in the sand. But there's also, you know, kind of a balance between, okay, I know what's going on in the world, and I just spent 6 hours on Facebook or CNN.com or BBC or whatever, reading every single word I could find on this particular issue or that particular crisis. Because that creates a very different sense. Like, that's paralyzing.
Yes.
You know, and then it's like, we've just lost someone to news paralysis that could be out here helping us, you know.
Yeah, for sure. Because you're right, Jen, you're so right, because it's the people that are feeling that deeply, that have that sense of this isn't right, that can get overwhelmed by it. And actually, they're the folk that we need. You know, they're the folk that we need to stay well, to stay healthy, to find ways of expressing that voice and that call. And so, yeah, I think rationing and just being mindful about how you're taking that in and right. Not allowing it to overwhelm you is super important in these times for us.
And it's a balance for sure, right? Because we don't want to get to the point where, you know, I think we saw this from some quarters a few weeks ago with the shootings that happened in the US.
Yeah.
You know, this kind of sense of almost numbness.
Yeah.
You know, we've been here before. This is kind of, you know, but also it's important to still let ourselves feel how real situations are.
Yeah.
And, you know, just because it's happened before doesn't make it any less horrific.
Yeah.
And also, how do we keep going and not just fall into despair?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, how do you feel the feels? Because that's what we do. And we need to do that. If that's how we tick, we need to do that. Mm-hmm. How do you feel all those feels? How do you feel that sadness? And how do you allow that to kind of be transformed into fuel to sort of help you keep going and keep using your voice without becoming poorly or ill?
Right. Because if we're not feeling it, when we're just stockpiling it, that's going to have a consequence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Like that, you know, that's when it does kick over into things like illness and that kind of thing. So yeah, it is important to kind of have a balance.
Yeah.
With all of that. So I want to go back to a little bit on the women in leadership space, because one of the things that you mentioned on your website that I found really fascinating was this idea of the way that women compete in a professional environment. And I think how you put it on your website was something along the lines of, you used to come to work like you were, a contestant in the Hunger Games.
Yeah, I was, totally channeling Katniss Everdeen, which is really, for sure. I mean, again, it's things I think that we take on without realizing it, ideas or notions that just become the cultural norm. But I think there's a couple of things that happen for us on our way to leadership. I think without realizing it, we feel places are more limited for females. So it's kind of like you're looking around and going, hang on, there's not space for a natural instinct almost to compete.
Yeah.
And I don't remember ever being explicitly told that by anybody, but I definitely implicitly.
No, but it's right there in our patriarchal culture, right?
Yeah.
Like, if there's 10 seats at the table, there might be 2 that aren't for white men. Fight for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that notion. And then that's kind of like the Hunger Games, like that the cornucopia, like everybody rushing to kind of get those places. So there's that's in the mix. And there's secondly, and I think this is certainly true for me, and it all ties in, which is why I love the work that I do with people, is if you are a tick a bit differently female like I am, and you've not been acknowledging that for part of your career, and you've been trying to hide some of that or some of the tricksiness, you're also hiding your strengths. But I think what it does, it's back to that notion, we said about minimizing a program, you're not aware of it, but it's running. It drains your battery, which we talked about, but it also does something else, and this is super important for me. It tips you into a constant state of fight or flight. It's like you become hypervigilant because you are masking something, and you're hiding and you're trying to blend in. And that originates, even if you're not aware of it and it becomes the norm, it originates from a place of fear and almost shame, like, oh my goodness, I hope nobody can find out, about this. Or I know I tick differently, but I've got to hide that, I've got to paddle like Billy O, nobody can find out. And because it becomes your norm, you become less aware of it. But the seed of that is a place of fear. And if you're operating from a place of fear, whether you know it or not, you are tipping into fight or flight all of the time. And you're kind of hypervigilant for threat. And I think as females, that threat becomes other females, unfortunately. So what we do is we kind of compete quite hard against
sense, right? Because in general, we see in the workplace and everywhere else that women tend to be, and this isn't a generalization certainly, but tend to be a little more attuned to the people around them.
Yeah.
So in the situation that you're describing, where you're, sort of trying to hide things, I would imagine women are the ones who are at risk of finding out.
Yes.
And this one hits home for me really a lot too.
Yes.
Because, for a long time in my life, I kind of came at the world from a place of thinking that I was deeply fucked up. As a child, I identified with the villain in every story because I was pretty sure that's what I was.
Yeah.
And I did not cultivate female friendships for a long time into my adult life for that exact reason. It was so much easier to be around men because they had no interest in scratching the surface. That's not what they do. Right? Like,
yeah.
It's just kind of all just on the surface. Nobody's going to see anything that's going on.
Yeah.
And with women, I felt like they had this X-ray vision. They were so much more likely to kind of find me out.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're so right. And you kind of almost do that thing of I almost, I'm partly confiding in you, or you've spotted something and I know you've spotted it and you're being kind about that. But are you being kind about that? And you have all of this extra stuff that then kicks in. And while you're operating in fight or flight, that's how that's always going to run, I think.
Yeah.
So I think the work for me is twofold. It's about understanding that women are not our threat. All right, we can support other women on their way to leadership, and we can accept that they will do things differently. There's that space for diversity. And I think we can dial down the judgment that we have, because I think, I talked about at the start, but I think women, sometimes need to work extra hard to have credibility or be seen as competent. We are the worst at being part of that judgment. I think we judge other women more harshly. And I think, honestly, I've certainly done that on my leadership journey. So I think there's work for us to be able to kind of acknowledge that that is not the case. We're operating on the kind of wrong set of rules here. And the second piece of work for me, which is particularly for those of us that do the tick differently stuff, is find when you learn to drop the mask in a safe way. And I do have an ecology check around that because it needs to be done safely. You find that you are operating less in fight or flight, which we're not designed to be in. We are not designed to be in that for the length of time we spend there. That's part of the issues with our health. So when you come out of fight or flight and you go into a much healthier rest and digest mode for more of the time, which is where we're designed to live, when you're more comfortable with who you are, with your quirks, with your strengths, with your tricksiness, then you are not hypervigilant. And you perceive less things as threats, including other women. So that's where the work is for me twofold. It's around saying, women aren't your threat, extend a helping hand up to other women rather than fighting them and pushing them down. And secondly, do the work on yourself, because that's always where it comes back to, isn't it? Do the work on yourself and get to that place of being comfortable in your own skin. Be in rest and digest mode much more than fight or flight. Check yourself when you know you're in fight or flight for too long. Dial down that hypervigilance, and then you're not going to see threats where there are none.
No, and you are going to be able to see so many other things that when we have that tunnel vision of that fight or flight energy, we're not able to see. Getting out of that opens up our creativity, so many things get opened up when you get
massively. I mean, everything just becomes, you find ease. You learn to find ease, and that is a much better, if you compare that showing up fully and finding ease to the paddling like Billy O and feeling like an imposter, there's no choice unto which do you want. Well, obviously, you want the better one, and there is a journey to get there, Jen. I think it's not a straightforward hop from one to the other, but I think that's where the interesting work is.
Absolutely. And I also think it's where truly mentoring, we've talked about, the women that are coming up behind us comes in, because I think for a long time there's been a vein, and maybe even the most prominent vein, of work around women's leadership, and I'm putting this in air quotes here, and empowering women, that has been well intended, but what it really has been is women working with the women that are under them or younger than them or whatever, to teach them to behave more like men.
Yes.
In a corporate setting.
Yes.
And that's
Absolutely.
not really helpful. It's teaching all of this stuff that we're talking about today, how do you mask, how do you, and I think really what true mentorship is for the next generation is for us to be able to be open to the quirkiness, the diversity of thought, the different styles of leadership that maybe we haven't thought about yet, and nurture that instead of trying to stuff those young women into boxes.
Absolutely, because you're so right. And I think it comes back to that thing of, you can't squash and hide your quirkiness and your tricksiness without really dimming down your brilliance.
Yeah.
And the world needs your brilliance. The world needs you to show up with your quirkiness and yourself. And if you don't do that, nobody else can. What's in you is in nobody else. And if you keep it in you and don't let that shine, it will never find its way in the world. And I think, what a loss. We have some brilliant women and young women coming through. Let them shine. Be diverse in what we view as success and what we view as leaders. And when we have that full range of diversity, we'll actually have more rounded solutions to the problems that are going on in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just so appreciate the work that you're doing because I think it's amazing.
Thank you, Jen.
So I guess we're kind of winding down out of time here, but thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. I love your work. I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing because I do feel like it's helping to kind of change the way that we look at women and women leaders, and the fact that more women are leaders than might self-identify.
Absolutely.
So, and I would love to have you back again sometime to talk about, what's going on in your world and how your work progresses.
Oh, I would love that, Jen. Thank you so much.